Hello and welcome to So Much for Pathos, the show that takes cinema underneath the microscope and, like all good scientists, smashes it into a million billion bits. I'll be your detective for this evening. The world of quantum mechanics, which I am of course a massive expert on, gave us one of science's greatest thought experiments, the sad and tragic tale of Schrödinger's cat.
Now, I'm simplifying horribly here, but the theory hypothesised that if you put a cat in a box along with a canister of poison gas that may or may not leak and close the lid, then according to quantum theory, once the box is out of view, the cat would neither be dead or alive, but both dead and alive until you open the box to observe it. In other words, it's possible for something to exist in two contradictory states at the same time, which is impossible but somehow possible. It makes your head hurt.
And at the risk of sounding pretentious, I'd like to apply this complex theorem to the case of the lovely bones. Let's go over the case notes.
The Lovely Bones was a 2002 novel written by Alice Sebold, which told the tale of a 14-year-old girl, Susie Salmon, who is killed by a serial murderer and documents her journey into the afterlife as Susie learns to come to terms with her own death.
Basically, it's What Dreams May Come meets Seven.
In the year 2000, Film 4 bought the movie rights to Alice Sebold's half-finished manuscript, with director Lynn Ramsay attached to adapt and direct in 2001. And for the longest time, this is how the movie was going to turn out, but script problems stopped the movie from beginning production. Supposedly, the producers weren't entirely happy with Ramsay's screenplay as it departed significantly from the source material, which eventually led to her being replaced by Peter Jackson in 2004, just prior to King Kong and just after the release of Return of the King. With Jackson on board, production moved a lot smoother, with his wife Fran Walsh on screenplay duty, and DreamWorks becoming co-producers and Paramount signing on as distributors for a March 2009 release, which was eventually pushed back to November for awards season. Upon its release, critical opinion was mostly split down the middle, with one half of the audience stating that it was fantastic and the other half arguing that it was an enormous stack of poo-poo pancakes.
So I hope you'll now see my interest in this case. Let's investigate.
In the opening moments of the film, we're introduced to the Salmon family. Jack, played by Mark Wahlberg, Abigail, played by Rachel Weisz, little sister Lindsay, played by Rose McIver, little brother Buckley, played by Christian Thomas Ashdale, and finally Susie, our lead character, played by Saoirse Ronan. Now in the book, Susie's murder comes at the beginning, whereas here it takes us a good 20 minutes to get to that point, which isn't necessarily a bad thing as it gives us enough time to get to know Susie. It's the year 1973 and Susie lives with her family in a small Pennsylvania town where she attends high school and aspires to be a photographer when she grows up. She also appears to have a rather shy and chaste relationship with boys, as demonstrated in this scene where she tells us about a guy called Ray Singh.
But I was too busy thinking about the length of Ray Singh's eyelashes. I had counted each one in library time while he was reading Abelard and Heloise, the most seriously tragic love story ever.
I hate twee romantic dialogue like this. Firstly because it's romantic and therefore the enemy, and secondly because it's written so syrupy and sugary that I'm in serious danger of getting diabetes of the ears.
Especially in a later scene where she meets Ray by her locker, Susie comes out of film club with her friend Clarissa.
Othello. What is that? It sounds like a mint.
That guy looked pretty stupid with black makeup on.
Who?
The one with two first names.
Oh, Lawrence Oliver.
What a loser.
Moving on.
And she meets Ray in a brief exchange in which they have a fair bit of semi-Twilight-inspired awkward dialogue and make arrangements to meet at the mall after school. Credit where credit's due, Saoirse Ronan is incredibly well suited for the role and manages to bring a sense of earnest frailty to Susie in her performance, and by far is the best actor in the film, only to be equally matched by Stanley Tucci as the sinister Mr. Harvey in the next few scenes. On her way home, taking a shortcut across a cornfield, Susie meets Mr. Harvey, who appears to be standing there for pretty much no reason and invites her into a secret compartment under the ground, which she accepts.
Now, a potential flaw could be that Susie should know better than to go down there with someone that she barely knows, but to be honest, Susie is characterised as being fairly naive, so I don't necessarily have a problem with this.
And it's in this next scene that the movie starts playing its hand and becomes genuinely uncomfortable to watch. There's nothing particularly gruesome going on here in terms of imagery, therefore this scene relies entirely upon the interaction between the two characters, and it just goes to show a testament towards how important good casting is.
Do you have a boyfriend? Oh? I knew it, see? I knew you weren't like those other girls. I knew that.
Susie stays down there long enough to miss dinner with her family and they start becoming understandably concerned. When Susie goes to make a break for the exit, she appears to escape, at which point the movie takes a slightly Silent Hill-esque turn as she arrives at her house to find nobody home and Mr. Harvey washing himself in the bathroom. When Susie suddenly realises she's been killed, she fades away. Meanwhile, back in the real world, Abigail calls the police and Jack goes into town on foot to find her. The next time we see Susie, she awakes in a mysterious landscape where her journey towards accepting her own fate begins.
The interesting thing about The Lovely Bones is that whilst I maintain that the central characters are brilliantly brilliantly cast and well performed, and not much attention has been paid to the supporting roles, which is really going to kick him in the arse later on. So let's start with Jack.
I want to say this as clearly as possible without any misinterpretation. Mark Wahlberg is really wrong for this material. I certainly don't think he's a bad actor, not by a long shot, but he's the character who stands out to me as being the one who's the most miscast. But there's actually a really good explanation for this. In the original casting, Ryan Gosling was going to play Jack, but due to creative differences regarding his physical appearance and other disagreements between him and Peter Jackson, Ryan Gosling ended up leaving the film. The problem was, when he left, the production was roughly 3 days away from beginning filming, and Peter Jackson had to find a replacement quickly. He said that Mark Wahlberg has always been his first choice for the role anyway, but he couldn't do it initially because of commitments to other films. However, Mark had just finished shooting The Happening, which was also shot in Pennsylvania around the same time that Ryan Gosling had left. So Mark Wahlberg came onto the shoot 1 day before they started.
Which essentially means that Mark went from this set...
Planning on stealing something?
No, ma'am, we're not.
Plan on murdering me in my sleep?
What? No.
And walked all the way over to this set...
Don't worry, kiddo. He has a nice life. He's trapped in a perfect world.
with little to no prep time whatsoever.
He's not necessarily bad in this. Mark's definitely trying his best with the material that he's been given, considering that he wasn't in rehearsals when everyone else was learning their lines. And there are actually a few good moments in the film where he does a decent job. Take this scene, for instance. Prior to Susie's murder, she has a father-daughter character-building moment with Jack, and they make a ship in a bottle together.
Did Mom know before she married you? About your obsession?
Susie, hobbies are healthy. They teach you things.
Like what?
Like if you start something, you finish it. You don't stop until you get it right. If you don't get it right, you start over again, and you keep on going as long as you have to. That's the way it is. That's what you do. It's perfectly normal.
Yes, Susie, now let me wash my hands, and I'm rubbing and rubbing and rubbing and rubbing and rubbing and rubbing and rubbing. Sorry. This is a touching moment.
Actually, this scene is fairly important as it establishes Jack's fastidiousness, which will be relevant later. But as the movie goes on, his portrayal continues to be far too quirky, even to the point of being comedic, which really confuses the tone of some scenes.
I know you're looking at the obvious suspects. Convicted felons, child molesters, and I understand why, but Len, I think you're coming at it from the wrong angle.
Honey.
Herman Stolfus, just across the street. Now, he appears to be perfectly normal, but Len, the man wears adult diapers.
Herman is 80 years old.
I followed him in the supermarket. His shopping cart was filled with them.
This is a man obsessed with finding the man who killed his daughter, tortured by his failure to protect his own family and the fear of losing those he's left, whose obsession has become self-destructive to the point where, in the book at least, destroys his career and eventually contributes to his wife leaving him. This is no place for Goofy.
We need to start working backwards. You start looking at family histories, criminal records, mental health issues.
Jack,
I've been
this
doing a lot of
doesn't
reading on this
change
subject.
anything.
Did I mention taxes? Len, you can tell a lot about a person from taxes.
Please.
He's so goofy here, he's practically gurning. I mean, does this look like grief to anyone?
And then there's Rachel Weisz's character Abigail, who's mostly reliant on making Mark Wahlberg look good in this film. However, her character appears to be suffering from an incomplete arc. She's lost her oldest daughter and falls out of love with Jack and leaves, only for her to come back a few months later because of reasons. A lot of the action she does is mainly because the plot calls for it, and as a result her characterisation suffers greatly. In the novel, she feels a sense of losing her own identity because of the arrival of their third child, and as a result Abigail falls out of love with Jack without realising it. And this is very much a key component to her character, but here it's only vaguely implied, and Abigail just kind of appears to leave because she can't deal with Susie's death.
There's nothing inherently wrong with that last part, but what I'm saying is that it ends up robbing her of a lot of really solid character development.
And then there's Lindsay, her younger sister. Now, as the younger sister of a murdered teenager, she has to deal with a lot of unwanted focus of her family's unresolved grief, with loved ones constantly looking at her with haunted eyes as they see shadows and reflections of her sister in her. And as she grows and does things teenage girls do, first kiss, first love, graduation and so on, things that Susie never got to do, she will often find herself living in the shadow of a dead girl. Well, in the book that is, here she just kind of jogs a lot.
I suppose a majority of these problems can be attributed to Fran Walsh & Co.'s screenplay, which is adequate but severely malnourished, like a vegan crack addict.
Unfortunately, the key to adapting The Lovely Bones successfully is in the portrayal of the relationships and development of the supporting characters, for reasons I'll come back to at the end, something Walsh and Jackson don't seem to grasp. Following the murder, the characters in the book are shown coping and adapting over a period of a decade. Their film versions get 2 hours and a montage, which inevitably limits how much of a story you can give each of them. Sam, her sister's boyfriend and later fiancé, and his brother are practically absent, and his little brother is just an angelic little roll of wallpaper. So Susie has joined the choir invisible, and it's at this point that we meet Holly, a non-specific entity who accompanies Susie through heaven. She tells her that they're not quite there yet, at which point Susie begins to realise the gravity of what she has to leave behind.
Don't get me wrong, The Lovely Bones doesn't 100% piss in your cornflakes, there are a few genuinely good bits.
Saoirse Ronan really delivers during the solemn character building moments as she walks through heaven, particularly in this really nice bit where she rages over her image after she died.
Look at me! Look at what he did to me! What am I now? The dead girl? The lost girl? The missing girl? I'm nothing!
That's the thing that makes The Lovely Bones most annoying. When the film is firing at all cylinders, it comes incredibly close to excellent.
But a big problem that the movie suffers from is that Peter Jackson has an enormous amount of trouble juggling the tone.
Take for instance this next moment where Jack smashes all of his bottled ships, which seems to have an effect on Susie's heavenscape, but he ultimately decides to save one of them, the ship that he and Susie made together. It's a sequence that's actually really well put together, albeit with perhaps a little too much emphasis on CGI.
A topic that we'll get back to later.
But that sequence is then followed by an unbelievably jarring montage where Susie and Holly frolic around in the in-between in scenes that resemble a yellow submarine version of Super Mario Galaxy.
And that's not the only time that the movie does this.
There's a scene at the very beginning where Susie's younger brother swallows a twig in the garden and Susie has to race him to the hospital in her dad's car, and it starts off as somewhat panicky, but in a moment's notice suddenly shifts into a comedy scene where she has to manically dodge cars, before going back to serious drama mode when they get to the hospital.
Could you just pick a fucking tone already, Mr. Jackson, for fuck's sake?
What happens for a majority of the film from now on is Susie watching over her family coping. Jack starts to collaborate with the police in finding Susie in an increasingly intrusive way whilst unintentionally neglecting Abigail, who appears to be grief-stricken the worst. Grandma Lynn, played by Susan Sarandon, comes over to stay and help her out, but to no avail.
That is cooking, Sherry. Please,
You have
please.
to find a way to live with this.
Live with it? I am living with this. I am dealing. I'm coping.
Don't go into
I'm
Susan.
dealing
You
with
won't
it.
let
So
anybody
what?
touch her things. You have a tomb in the middle of your house. Oh, sweetheart, do you really think if you seal it up that the pain's gonna go away?
And soon afterwards, Abigail leaves for California to do some soul-searching. We also see Mr. Harvey, who a while after Susie's killing begins to feel empty and starts searching for potential victims. In other news, Lindsay ends up falling in love with a boy at school, and the oh-so-precious Ray is in a relationship with a girl called Ruth.
I'm assuming that they're together over the loss of Susie, but I don't buy that they'd be together this quickly, that is, unless Ray is some sort of closet necrophiliac.
Back to Mr. Harvey now, and it seems he's picked his next target in the shape of Lindsay and proceeds to stalk her for the next few days, eventually drawing up plans to build a hunting blind in his back garden. Meanwhile, Jack finishes processing the photographs that Susie left behind and discovers a photo of Mr. Harvey in his front garden.
The plot, as they say, thickens into a huge ball of concrete made up of multiple plot threads. And incidentally, I hope you're paying attention to all this, because this part of the script was really fucking hard for us to write.
So Jack goes over to visit after work and doesn't see him at his house, so he goes to leave. I do really like the moment where you can see Mr. Harvey hiding from him and he accidentally drops all of his wood whilst he sees Susie's ghost cycling past. That works quite nicely. What's interesting is that when he offers to help Mr. Harvey, there's a moment where Jack hallucinates seeing a rosebud bloom from death in the palm of his hand, which is kind of meant to be a sign from Susie that he's the culprit.
Albeit it feels slightly vague, but hey, miracles, am I right?
So won over by Mr. Flower's compelling argument but lacking any evidence to back up his accusation, Jack goes crazy and runs out into the cornfield at night with a baseball bat hoping to catch Mr. Harvey alone and kill him. Instead he surprises two teenage lovers from Susie's school, supporting characters only important for this scene, in which the boy, presumably angry at being ninja cockblocked, grabs Jack's baseball bat and cripples him with it. Meanwhile, Susie visits a heavenly simulacrum of Mr. Harvey's house, wherein she discovers two important things. Firstly, that she's one of several victims over a number of years, another of whom is her new friend, guide, person, Holly. You'd think she would have mentioned that small detail to Susie at the start, but goes to sneaky bastards like that. And secondly, she sees Mr. Harvey still has her remains locked up in a safe in his basement. Hang on a second, so Mr. Harvey, apparently a criminal mastermind who has evaded identification and capture for years, not only targeting Lindsay and all, but plans to kill twice in the same area so the two crimes can be immediately connected, but has kept the incriminating remains of one of the victims in his own bloody house? He didn't even kill her there. He could have just collapsed the hole of her still inside and it would have made 10 times as much sense.
The film makes a great deal of his months of planning and finely honed instincts, but apparently he brings mutilated cadavers home on purpose.
In the book, the scene where he disposes of the body happens almost immediately, whereas here the scene is moved towards the end in what I can only imagine is the most incredibly ill-judged attempt to bring tension to the third act. How the third act begins is Lindsay, in her natural habitat of jogging outside, breaks into Mr. Harvey's house and, looking around, eventually stumbles upon the conveniently incriminating sketchbook of his drawings that he keeps under the floorboards. Inconveniently, however, Mr. Harvey comes home and what ensues is a really tense and staggeringly well-executed chase scene. And after being discovered, Mr. Harvey packs all of his stuff away, preparing to skip town, taking Susie's body in the safe away with him to dump. Rather annoyingly, when Lindsay gets home, Abigail returns and the plot completely stops dead upon her arrival.
My girl.
Yeah, that's fine and everything, guys, but there's a serial killer still on the loose. You wanna wrap this one up quickly?
The cops swiftly arrive at Mr. Harvey's house whilst Harvey himself is at the sinkhole dumping Susie's remains, at which point we return to Susie, who appears to be ready to leave Earth behind. In this moment she's introduced to all of Mr. Harvey's previous victims, and it's a moment that's as staggeringly beautiful as it is genuinely moving, and it makes sense because the cinematography was done by Andrew Lesnie, who has worked with Peter Jackson since Fellowship, and his work on this film has pretty much been consistently excellent.
Albeit the overlit 1970s brown and yellow look makes it look like someone smeared a fucking caramel all over the lens.
Susie is prepared to leave but needs to do one final thing before she goes. Ruth stands watching Mr. Harvey with suspicious eyes and suddenly sees Susie walking towards her. Susie then uses Ruth as a conduit to see Ray one final time,
because Ruth has the ability to see ghosts. Sorry, did we not mention that? It's just that Peter Jackson feels like the character isn't interesting enough to dwell on. Sorry, folks.
Anyway, they kiss and Susie is able to leave and Mr. Harvey gets away, albeit he's seen later falling down the side of a cliff trying to seduce a girl in a scene that was only unnecessarily extended because test audiences wanted to see him suffer more. So not only does it go on for too long, it's also unnecessarily violent. This scene is then followed by the famous final words from the book.
These were the lovely bones that had grown around my absence. The connections, sometimes tenuous, sometimes made at great cost, but often magnificent, that happened after I was gone. And I began to see things in a way that let me hold the world without me in it.
And it's this scene that's meant to be the centrepiece for both the book and the movie, but for my money only exemplifies precisely my problem with this film.
You see, any adaptation of an ideas-driven, genuinely deep and interesting book, such as The Lovely Bones or, say, Cloud Atlas, ultimately stands or falls on how well the writers can communicate the core concepts of the original. In Cloud Atlas, for example, the core ideas of the connections between all human beings across any distance and time, and the core struggles for humanity's soul repeating themselves generation after generation are retained. Yeah, it's tangled and messy at points, but the message comes through enough that the equivalent of the Lovely Bones speech, Sunmi's address, when these ideas are spelled out in black and white, there's context for them which allows the audience to understand and be genuinely moved. The film has its problems, but that was the most important minute of the film and it came off beautifully in a way that does the Wachowskis great credit.
The trouble is, you can't get these moments if you don't lay the foundations over the preceding 2 hours.
For those who haven't read the book, the lovely bones of the title are the intricate network of relationships and common experiences that grew up to fill the emotional hole that Susie left behind in people's lives. Basically, this speech is about how Susie, seeing the beautiful friendships, loves and sometimes just personal growth within her circle of friends and family, which were made possible by her tragic and violent death, finally comes to terms with what happened to her and is ready to move on to heaven proper. Unfortunately, most of those connections, those relationships and experiences and so on just don't exist in the film, because in an adaptation where the psychology and relationships of the supporting characters is of paramount importance, the supporting characters are just so underdeveloped. Take Sam and Lindsay's relationship, probably the best example. Sam is barely shown in the film, but in the book he and his brother essentially become like members of the family and surrogate brothers to Buck. And Sam and Lindsay, drawn together by grief, form an enormously close bond. A far closer kind of love, it is implied, than they would have experienced without the catalyst of Susie's murder, to the extent that by the time Sam proposes to Lindsay after leaving college, they have actually started to look alike.
These are the lovely bones which grew up in her absence, and these are what give her words emotional context in the book.
But as film viewers, what we've had so far is an erratic crime thriller interspersed with elegiac CGI imagery. We've only had good characterisation of Susie and Mr. Harvey, the two major characters who are, for all intents and purposes, irrelevant to this scene, which means that the speech, albeit perfectly delivered by Saoirse Ronan, just falls flat. Because there's no context for her words, not only do they lack impact, but they just don't make any sense. Susie then closes off the movie with her final words.
My name is Salmon, like the fish. First name Susie. I was 14 years old when I was murdered on December 6th, 1973. I was here for a moment, and then I was gone. I wish you all a long and happy life.
And then she's undercut by a surprisingly out-of-place chirpy song in the credits. The Lovely Bones frustrates me, almost to the point where I can't quite make up my mind.
There are elements of The Lovely Bones which are absolutely pitch perfect and it makes me want to recommend it on those moments alone, but they're almost completely cancelled out by some truly misguided production decisions, mainly from the script side of things, that make me want to tell you that you should give it a miss. The movie suffers from really bizarre tonal shifts that eject you out of the film and stop you from engaging in the drama, which makes the gravity of the subject matter seem really weightless, and it's this sense of cognitive dissonance that reminds me of Schrodinger's cat.
Because whilst the novel was based on heavy subject matter which is palpably real, the movie, for all its CGI grandstanding and the heaven sequences, make it feel palpably unreal.
Based on the fact that a majority of the budget went on CGI, I strongly get the sense that Peter Jackson is more interested in Susie's story rather than anyone else's, and as a result it skews the movie in favour of one character rather than maintaining a balance between all the key players, which is a major failing in adapting something as multi-stranded as The Lovely Bones. And speaking of CGI, whilst it does look very impressive and neatly designed, it only serves to add to the film's overall weightlessness. I mean, I personally see no reason why this couldn't have been shot on location whilst using CGI to expand upon the imagery. I can think of locations such as the Scottish Highlands or certain areas of Reykjavik where this movie would have looked awesome. One of the reasons why I feel the Lord of the Rings trilogy works as well as it does in terms of its excellent sense of world building is that a lot of it was shot on location, and it gives you an amazing sense of scope across the character's journey. So for the life of me, I can't understand why Peter Jackson wouldn't apply the same logic here. I feel that The Lovely Bones is ultimately a failure, but it's a failure with the best of intentions. I sense that Peter Jackson does sincerely love the characters in the original source material, considering the amount of effort on his part to get the thing onto screen, trying to make it feel as emotional and beautifully framed as he possibly can in trying to do the material justice.
But to a certain extent, its biggest selling point is also its biggest flaw. In trying to adapt The Lovely Bones into a visually spectacular blockbuster, it does too much and ultimately cripples itself under its own weight.
Honestly though, I can't hate on this movie too much as I found myself towards the end becoming genuinely attached to the characters, particularly Susie, who I suppose is a testament to Saoirse Ronan's excellent central performance. So I suppose in summary, The Lovely Bones is a mixed bag of striking visuals, varying degrees of acting talent and infuriatingly muddy writing.
If you're interested in picking up anything Lovely Bones related, I'd suggest picking up Alice Sebold's novel. Trust me, it comes damn near close to being a masterpiece, whereas the movie isn't. And on that note, I call that case closed. I'm Matt Crowley, and that was The Lovely Bones. I wonder what Lynn Ramsay did after she got fired.